I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you personally for all the wonderful messages of support and for your understanding.
King Charles takes Camilla's crown and gives it to Catherine. What she did next shocked Britain. Okay, stay with this for a moment, because the crown at the center of this story was not supposed to change hands like this. According to the dramatic claim now surrounding the royal family, King Charles took the crown associated with Queen Camilla and offered it to Catherine, Princess of Wales, in a moment that appeared to turn a private family tension into a public question about the future of the monarchy. And then Catherine did something nobody in that room was expecting. She did not smile. She did not immediately accept the honor. Instead, the claim says she placed the crown back before Charles and demanded to know why Camilla's right to keep it had suddenly been questioned. That is what makes this story so explosive. It is not simply about one woman receiving a crown from another. It is about power, loyalty, humiliation, and the future face of the British monarchy. Now, take a look at what that moment would actually mean. Camilla is not just another member of the royal family. She is the woman who stood beside Charles for decades and eventually became queen. Catherine is not simply another royal either. She is the Princess of Wales, the wife of the future king, and one of the most closely watched women in Britain. Put those two women on opposite sides of a crown, place Charles between them, and suddenly a piece of ceremonial jewelry becomes something much more dangerous. It becomes a message. Hi viewers, if you saw Charles hand Camilla's crown to Catherine, would you want Catherine to accept it, or would you tell her to stand up for Camilla? Comment just one word, Catherine or Camilla, because that simple choice says where you stand.
The country whose title I've been so greatly privileged to bear during so much of my life and duty. With Catherine beside him, our new Prince and Princess of Wales will, I know, continue to inspire and lead our national conversations, helping to bring the marginal to the center ground, where vital help can be given.
The room, in this account, was already tense before Catherine touched the crown. Charles had made his decision. Camilla had every reason to understand what it appeared to mean. William was watching. Catherine was standing directly in the path of a decision that could have transformed the atmosphere around the family in seconds. There was no comfortable way out. If she accepted, it could look like she had taken something from Camilla. If she refused, she would be challenging the very decision of the king. And that is where the silence becomes important. Because Catherine's reported response was not a dramatic speech. It was something far more unsettling. She allegedly looked at the crown, then back toward Charles, and refused to treat it as a prize. Her concern was not whether she deserved the honor. Her concern was why Camilla had apparently been placed in the position of losing it. That distinction changes the entire story. For years, royal coverage has often reduced the women surrounding the throne to simple comparisons. Camilla against Catherine, past against future, established queen against future queen. One woman carries the weight of a complicated history. The other represents a new generation. But the scene described in this claim cuts through that easy rivalry. Catherine is not portrayed as fighting Camilla. She is portrayed as questioning the reason for the fight itself. And if that is what happened, even as a disputed account circulating around the royal story, then Charles faced a problem far greater than a disagreement over ceremonial symbolism. He faced a woman who would not accept an advantage if that advantage depended on another woman's humiliation. That is the part that could make the palace uncomfortable, because a crown can be removed, a title can change, a ceremonial arrangement can be rewritten. But once a royal figure openly asks why something is happening, the question can travel much farther than the room where it was first asked. What exactly had changed? Why was Camilla suddenly being treated as though her position could be questioned? Why was Catherine being placed in the position of receiving something so closely associated with the current queen? And most importantly, why would Charles make such a move at all? Those questions matter because the British monarchy survives on symbolism. Every seat has meaning. Every title carries history. Every uniform, jewel, balcony appearance, procession, and photograph can communicate hierarchy without a single word being spoken. A crown does not need to be explained to make people understand who holds power. That is why this alleged moment is so compelling. If Charles had simply handed Catherine another honor, it would have been another royal appointment, another ceremony, another photograph for the newspapers. But a crown associated with Camilla carries a different emotional charge. It reaches backward into Charles's marriage, into the painful history that followed him for decades, and forward toward the reign that will eventually belong to William and Catherine. And that is where the story begins to become much darker. Because Catherine's refusal, if the reported account is taken seriously, did not end the confrontation. It exposed it. Charles could no longer hide behind ceremony. Camilla could no longer assume that the crown represented unquestioned security. And Catherine could no longer be viewed simply as the woman waiting patiently for her own future. She had become the person asking the question that nobody wanted answered in public. What had Charles discovered? What had changed behind the palace walls? And why was Camilla suddenly at the center of a decision that appeared to point toward Catherine? The answer cannot be understood by looking only at that single moment. The crown did not appear out of nowhere. Neither did the tension surrounding it. Beneath that glittering symbol was a history of loyalty, resentment, public judgment, and royal survival that had been building for years.
As I've said to them, I am well and getting stronger every day by focusing on the things that will help me heal in my mind, body, and spirits. Having William by my side is a great source of comfort and reassurance too, as is the love, support, and kindness that has been shown by so many of you. It means so much to us both.
And before Catherine could decide whether to wear the crown, she first had to understand what Camilla had sacrificed to receive it. And perhaps that is why the silence surrounding the claim feels so heavy. The most revealing part may not be who touched the crown first, but who refused to wear it when the cost of doing so became impossible to ignore publicly. If you care about what really sits behind the crown, do not scroll away now, because the next part gets worse for Camilla, and the history behind her crown makes Catherine's refusal far more shocking. Camilla's crown was never simply a piece of royal jewelry. It represented the end of a battle that had lasted for decades, and that history explains why any suggestion that it could be taken away would carry such force. When Charles married Camilla on April 9, 2005, their relationship was already burdened by years of public controversy. The marriage did not begin with the clean approval normally associated with a future king and his bride. Princess Diana remained a powerful presence in public memory, and Camilla entered royal life knowing that many people had already formed an opinion about her. That mattered because the question of her future title had become politically sensitive long before Charles became king. There was an expectation that she might eventually be known as Princess Consort rather than Queen Consort. The distinction sounded technical, but it was anything but technical. A title determines how an individual is positioned inside the institution, and Camilla's title would inevitably be judged against the history surrounding Charles. Then Charles became king. The old question returned with a different answer. Camilla was Queen Consort at the coronation in Westminster Abbey on May 6, 2023. The official service recorded her anointing and crowning, and she was crowned with Queen Mary's crown. The symbolism was unmistakable. After years of uncertainty, the institution had formally placed the crown on her head. But there was another detail that made the ceremony significant. Charles wanted the coronation to establish the hierarchy of his reign. The focus was the king and queen. Other members of the family were present, but the ceremony was carefully structured around the sovereign and his consort. Catherine and William were not there as rival claimants to the crown. They were there as the couple representing the next stage of the succession. That distinction is crucial. Catherine's future was already secure in a way Camilla's never had been. She did not need to fight for a route to queenship through public persuasion or a change in royal policy. Her position flowed from her marriage to William, the heir to the throne. If William eventually becomes king, Catherine's constitutional role as his queen consort follows from that succession. Camilla's situation is fundamentally different. Her queenship belongs to Charles's reign. It is tied to the man beside whom she serves. Catherine's future queenship is tied to the next reign. That simple difference gives the crown two separate meanings. For Camilla, it represents a rival. For Catherine, it represents inheritance. And that is why the supposed decision to move Camilla's crown toward Catherine carries such a provocative message. It would not merely suggest that one royal woman was being favored over another. It would collapse the boundary between the present reign and the future one. There is another reason the symbolism became so sensitive. The monarchy has always depended on carefully managed transitions. The public must see continuity, not chaos. When one reign ends, the institution cannot appear to be fighting with itself over who belongs at the center. Every gesture has to reinforce the idea that the crown survives even when individual monarchs change. That is where Camilla's position becomes complicated. She spent years moving from being one of the most controversial figures surrounding Charles to becoming an accepted working member of the royal family. Her public work has expanded beyond the original controversy. She has supported literacy, reading, health causes, and campaigns addressing domestic abuse and sexual violence. Whatever people think about her past, she has spent years building a working identity within the institution. Taking that history into account makes the crown far more difficult to treat as an interchangeable object. It also explains why Catherine's alleged hesitation matters. If she simply accepted the symbol without question, critics could interpret the moment as a victory over Camilla. They could say the future queen had benefited from the current queen's humiliation. But if Catherine questioned the decision, she would be doing something very different. She would be separating her own future from the destruction of Camilla's present. That distinction gives the story its strongest tension. The monarchy does not need two queens competing for the same reign. It can have a current queen and a future queen without declaring war between them. The real danger begins when symbolism makes the succession look like a replacement campaign, and the public has always been sensitive to that kind of imagery. A royal family can survive disagreement. What it struggles to survive is the appearance of division at the exact moment it needs stability. The 2023 coronation, therefore, becomes more than an event to look backward at. It becomes the baseline for understanding every later signal. Camilla had been publicly crowned. Catherine had not. Camilla was serving within Charles's reign. Catherine was preparing for a future reign alongside William. So if a later moment appeared to reverse those positions, viewers would naturally ask what had happened in between. That question became even more relevant as Catherine's public role expanded. Her appointment as Colonel of the Irish Guards gave her a prestigious military connection and reinforced her place within royal tradition. It was not a crown, and it did not make her queen. But appointments like this matter because they show how the institution distributes responsibility and visibility. The contrast should not be exaggerated into proof of a secret struggle. Royal appointments are formal decisions with their own history and protocol. Yet symbolism remains part of the monarchy's language, and observers inevitably study where important responsibilities are placed. Catherine's growing profile also changed the public conversation. She increasingly came to represent a younger generation of the royal family. William and Catherine were associated with the next reign, while Charles and Camilla represented the current one. That does not mean the two couples were enemies. It means the monarchy naturally contained two timelines at once. The present had a king and queen. The future had an heir and his wife. The tension came from the fact that public attention does not always follow constitutional order. People can become fascinated by the future before the present has ended.
As the Queen herself did with such unswerving devotion, I too now solemnly pledge myself, throughout the remaining time God grants me, to uphold the constitutional principles at the heart of our nation.
That is exactly what happened around Catherine's image. Her appearances, family life, charitable work, and recovery from a serious health crisis generated enormous public interest. Her popularity became part of the wider discussion about the monarchy's long-term strength. But popularity is not constitutional power. That distinction must remain clear. Catherine cannot become queen simply because she is more popular than another royal. The succession determines the monarch. Public approval can influence how the institution presents itself, but it does not rewrite the law. That is why the crown in this story matters as a symbol rather than evidence of a legal transfer. And this is where the narrative takes its next turn. because by the time Catherine's future queenship began attracting intense attention, the palace was facing a much larger question than who looked strongest in photographs. It was facing the challenge of preparing one reign without making the current reign look disposable. Camilla had already earned her place through years of service. Catherine represented what came next. The two truths could exist together, but royal symbolism has a way of forcing choices where the Constitution does not require them. A photograph can make a transition look immediate. A headline can make a future title feel present. A crown placed in the wrong context can make an ordinary succession appear to be a personal rejection. And that is precisely why the alleged confrontation surrounding Catherine becomes so important. If she really was offered Camilla's crown, the question was never simply whether Catherine wanted it. The question was whether she understood what accepting it would say about Camilla. That is the point at which this story stops being a contest between two royal women and becomes a test of Catherine's judgment. The crown Camilla waited decades to receive had finally become a symbol of something larger than her own status. It represented acceptance after controversy, recognition after uncertainty, and the completion of a long journey. So if Catherine placed it down instead of wearing it, she would not merely be refusing jewelry, she would be refusing the message attached to it. And that is why the next stage of this story matters so much. Because once Catherine's future began to overshadow Camilla's present, every appointment, every public appearance, and every royal signal could be interpreted as part of a transition that had not officially begun. And there was one more problem. Catherine's rise was no longer being discussed only as a distant possibility. The language around her future was becoming increasingly direct, and that changed how every royal gesture could be read. Once people began asking what kind of queen she would become, the question of Camilla's place became unavoidable. The future had started entering the room while the present was still firmly seated on the throne. Nobody inside the palace could ignore it. If this story matters to anyone who believes royal power should be questioned rather than blindly applauded, then leaving this video without sharing it means letting the loudest version of the story win. Stay with it, because what came next pushed the tension between Camilla's present and Catherine's future into territory the palace could no longer easily ignore. The question was no longer whether Catherine would become queen one day, it was whether the monarchy had already started treating her like one. That distinction became harder to ignore as Catherine's public role expanded. She was no longer simply William's wife waiting behind the scenes. She had become one of the most visible representatives of the institution, and every appearance carried a second meaning. People were not only watching what she wore or where she stood. They were watching for signs of where the monarchy itself was heading. That is where the crown in this story becomes dangerous. A crown handed from Charles to Catherine would suggest a transfer of symbolic authority long before a constitutional transfer of power. It would make the future look present. It would also raise an uncomfortable question about Camilla. If the current queen was still serving, why would the future queen suddenly be presented with a symbol so closely connected to the current reign? There is no established public evidence that Charles literally removed Camilla's crown and handed it to Catherine. That distinction matters. And this time, Catherine was no longer standing at the edge of power. The dramatic account remains a claim rather than a documented royal event. But the underlying question is real enough to explain why such a story captures attention. Catherine's position has changed dramatically, and the monarchy's future increasingly revolves around her and William. The shift became particularly noticeable after Catherine's return to public life following her health crisis. Her absence had created a rare gap in the royal family's public image. When she returned, attention followed her immediately. The public response was not simply about a princess resuming duties. It was about a major figure returning after an intensely personal period and choosing to step back into public responsibility. That gave Catherine something no title could manufacture: credibility. She had become more relatable to many people because her public life was no longer presented as effortless. Her family responsibilities, her recovery, and her return to duty created a different image from the polished royal portrait that had defined much of her earlier career. The monarchy had an opportunity to present her as someone capable of carrying responsibility under pressure, and Charles appeared to recognize the value of that. His relationship with Catherine became an increasingly interesting part of the royal story. Public moments between them often suggested warmth and mutual respect. More importantly, Charles's support for Catherine placed the future Princess of Wales in a stronger institutional position. That did not make her queen. It did something more subtle. It made her harder to ignore. The Irish Guards appointment was one example. Catherine's role as colonel gave her a significant connection to one of the most historic regiments associated with the royal family. It was a serious responsibility, not a decorative title. Her position within the military traditions of the monarchy strengthened the picture of a woman being prepared for a substantial future role. Then the media language became more revealing. In 2026, a Times profile examined the kind of queen Catherine might eventually become, including the idea that she could be a queen who listens. That language matters because it moved the conversation away from whether Catherine would become queen and toward what her reign might look like. That is a very different question. Once the public begins imagining a future reign, the current reign is inevitably viewed through another lens. Charles remains king. Camilla remains queen. Yet the audience begins looking beyond them. That is not necessarily rebellion. It is succession. Every monarchy contains a future inside its present. The difficulty comes when the future becomes more emotionally compelling than the people currently holding the titles. Catherine's growing public profile made that tension unavoidable. She represented continuity through William, but she also represented renewal. Her public image was associated with family, service, and a younger generation. She could appear modern without rejecting royal tradition. That combination gave the institution something valuable, a bridge. But bridges can create uncomfortable comparisons. Camilla's story had been shaped by controversy and endurance. Catherine's story was increasingly shaped by preparation and expectation. One woman had fought to be accepted into the role she eventually received. The other had entered a role that placed her directly in line for the future. Those are completely different journeys. The danger was that public comparison could turn those different journeys into a competition. And that is where the alleged crown incident becomes more revealing. If Charles had truly offered Catherine Camilla's crown, the act would have been impossible to interpret as neutral. It would have appeared to announce that the future had arrived early. It would have told Camilla that her position could be symbolically reassigned before her husband's reign had even ended. Catherine would therefore have faced a choice that had nothing to do with personal ambition. Accept the crown and risk looking as though she had benefited from Camilla's humiliation, reject it, and risk challenging the king's decision. Either choice carried consequences. That is why her reported refusal is the most important part of the account. It changes the emotional balance. A rivalry story needs two people fighting for the same prize. But Catherine's alleged response removes that simplicity. If she really placed the crown back before Charles, then she was not behaving like someone desperate to replace Camilla. She was behaving like someone who understood the political meaning of accepting it. That would have put Charles in a difficult position. The king could not easily dismiss the objection because Catherine was not rejecting the monarchy. She was questioning the circumstances surrounding the honor. There is a major difference. A person can accept the institution while challenging a decision made inside it. That difference is especially important in a royal family where obedience is often expected to remain invisible. Public disagreements are rare. Private disagreements are even harder to verify. That is why stories about palace tension spread so quickly. Silence creates space for interpretation, and the silence around Catherine's growing future role has repeatedly invited speculation. Was Charles deliberately strengthening Catherine because he believed William and Catherine were essential to the monarchy's survival? Was he simply fulfilling normal duties toward the heir's wife? Or were commentators reading a larger succession strategy into ordinary royal decisions? There is no reliable basis for claiming that every appointment was part of a secret plan. But the pattern is enough to generate questions. Catherine's position was becoming stronger while the monarchy was also preparing for a future that would eventually belong to William. The institution could not avoid that reality. It could only decide how visibly to acknowledge it. Then came the question of popularity. Public approval does not determine who becomes monarch. It cannot remove a king or queen from the throne. But popularity matters enormously to a modern monarchy, because the institution depends on public legitimacy. The royal family needs people to care about its representatives, support its work, and believe that the institution still has relevance. Catherine's appeal, therefore, had institutional value. If audiences responded strongly to her, the palace had a reason to keep her visible. If she attracted attention to causes associated with children, health, family life, and public service, those areas became part of the monarchy's modern image. That did not mean Camilla had failed. It meant the institution had more than one asset. Yet public attention is not distributed equally. The more Catherine became associated with the future, the more difficult it became to keep her symbolism completely separate from Camilla's position. The two women did not need to attack each other. The audience could create the comparison without either woman asking for it. One photograph could do it. One headline could do it. One crown could do it. That is precisely why the alleged decision by Charles carries such weight. It compresses years of succession politics into one image. Charles holds the symbol. Camilla is connected to its history. Catherine represents its future. And suddenly everyone has to decide what that image means. For Catherine, the answer could have been simple: accept the honor and move on. But according to the claim at the center of this story, she did not. She asked why. That question is more dangerous than an argument because it demands an explanation. It forces the person making the decision to reveal the reasoning behind it. And if the reasoning involved Camilla's position, then Catherine's refusal would have transformed a ceremonial gesture into a direct challenge. Not a challenge to Charles's authority, a challenge to the logic of the decision. That is the point where the story becomes personal. Charles had spent years building a relationship with Camilla that survived public hostility, private pain, and an enormous amount of scrutiny. If he suddenly appeared willing to diminish the symbol attached to her position, people would naturally ask whether something had changed between them, and Catherine would be standing at the center of that question. That is why viewers should not rush to treat this as a simple victory for one royal woman over another. The deeper issue is whether the monarchy can prepare for its future without humiliating the people who built its present. Because if Catherine truly refused the crown for that reason, then she did something far more consequential than accepting it. She forced Charles to confront the meaning of his own decision. And the next question is the one the palace would least want hanging in the air. If Camilla's crown could be questioned at all, what had happened behind the scenes to make Charles consider taking it from her? If that question is worth asking, then this is the moment to stay, subscribe, share this story, and refuse to let the uncomfortable part disappear, because what comes next puts Catherine, Camilla, and Charles in a far more serious confrontation. The crown was still within reach when Catherine reportedly made the decision that changed the meaning of the entire confrontation. She did not move toward it. She did not treat the moment as a triumph. Instead, according to the claim at the center of this story, she pushed the crown back toward Charles and asked the question that turned a royal ceremony into a family crisis. Why was Camilla being pushed aside? That question cut through everything. It cut through titles, protocol, popularity, and succession. It also placed Catherine in an extraordinary position. She was the woman supposedly being elevated, yet she was refusing to benefit from the apparent humiliation of the woman already holding the title. The distinction matters because there is no established public evidence that Charles literally took Camilla's crown and handed it to Catherine. The dramatic account remains unverified, but the underlying tension it represents is rooted in a real royal reality. Catherine is the future queen consort if William becomes king, while Camilla is the queen consort of Charles's reign. Their positions overlap in public attention, even though their constitutional paths are different. That is why the alleged refusal is so powerful as a narrative turning point. Catherine did not need to fight Camilla for a future crown. Her place in the succession was already tied to William. If the reported scene happened as described, accepting Camilla's symbol would have created an entirely different message. It could have looked like Catherine was accepting a victory that required another royal woman to lose. And that is where the room would have changed. Charles would have expected a decision. Camilla would have been waiting for an explanation. William would have understood immediately that this was no longer a routine ceremonial gesture. Catherine's hesitation would have become the loudest statement in the room. The most striking part would not have been her refusal itself. It would have been the reason behind it. Catherine was not allegedly saying that she did not deserve the honor. She was asking why the honor had been offered under those circumstances. That difference transformed the moment from ambition into scrutiny. For Charles, that created a problem. A king can make ceremonial decisions, but when the person receiving the honor asks why another member of the family is being diminished, the decision suddenly requires justification. The crown stops being an object and becomes evidence of a choice. What choice had Charles made? Was he trying to strengthen the monarchy's future? Was he responding to changing public attitudes? Was he protecting the institution from another difficult transition? Or was there something more personal behind the decision? No reliable public record answers those questions. That is exactly why speculation around the royal family becomes so intense. Palace silence does not prove a secret, it simply leaves space for competing interpretations. In this case, the silence allows one disturbing possibility to dominate the conversation. Perhaps the crown was never really about Catherine. Perhaps it was about Charles deciding what he wanted his legacy to look like. A monarch nearing the later stages of a reign has to think beyond the present. The next reign is already waiting. William is the heir. Catherine stands beside him. Their children represent another generation. The institution, therefore, has to prepare for a future that cannot be postponed simply because the current king remains on the throne. But preparation can easily look like replacement. That is the danger. If Charles publicly elevates Catherine too aggressively, people may conclude that Camilla has become irrelevant. If he protects Camilla too strongly, critics may argue that he is neglecting the future. The king therefore faces a balancing act that cannot be solved by a title alone. Catherine's alleged refusal makes that balance even harder. She would have forced Charles to separate two questions that had become tangled together. Who will be queen in the future, and why should the current queen be symbolically diminished today? Those are not the same question. The first is answered by succession. The second is about judgment. And Catherine's reported response, if accurate, would have exposed that difference in front of the people who mattered most. Camilla had a reason to feel wounded. Her journey to queenship had been unusually difficult. Her public image had been shaped by controversy surrounding Charles and Diana, and her eventual acceptance into the role required years of work. Whatever opinions remained about her past, she had become a working queen and had taken on public duties. To suddenly see a symbol associated with that position placed before Catherine would carry emotional consequences. It could feel like history was being rewritten without her. Catherine, meanwhile, had a different problem. If she accepted the crown, the public could interpret her as the beneficiary of that rewriting. Every photograph would invite comparison. Every headline would turn the gesture into a contest. The woman who was supposed to represent the future could suddenly be portrayed as the reason the present queen was losing ground. That would be disastrous for the monarchy. Catherine's greatest advantage has always been that her future role does not require her to attack anyone. She does not need to defeat Camilla to become queen consort. She simply has to remain beside William and wait for the constitutional transition. That makes the alleged refusal strategically significant. If Catherine really said no, she would have protected herself from being turned into a rival. She would also have protected the institution from creating an image of internal warfare. But there was a deeper consequence. Her refusal would have forced attention back onto Charles. The king could no longer allow the crown to speak for him. He would have to explain why it was being moved, why Camilla's position had been questioned, and why Catherine had been placed in the middle of it. That is where a private dispute becomes an institutional problem. Royal families can have disagreements. What they cannot easily control is how those disagreements look from the outside. A palace can close a door, but it cannot control every interpretation of what happens behind it. And the alleged confrontation contained every ingredient for a media storm. A reigning king, a current queen, a future queen, a crown, a succession question, and a refusal. It would be almost impossible for the public not to turn that scene into a referendum on the future monarchy. The crown therefore became a test of judgment, not simply a test of loyalty. Whoever controlled its meaning could influence how the public understood the transition waiting ahead for years. The important point is that Catherine's alleged refusal does not settle that argument. It makes the argument bigger, because once she questioned the decision, the audience was forced to look beyond the crown itself. The real issue became trust. Did Catherine trust Charles's explanation? Did Charles trust Catherine's judgment? Did Camilla believe her position was secure? And did William see the situation as a family disagreement or as a warning about the future of the monarchy? Those questions are not answered publicly. They should not be presented as confirmed private facts. But they reveal why the alleged scene has such power. It creates a collision between personal loyalty and institutional strategy. And there is another layer. Catherine's refusal would have given Camilla something she could not easily demand for herself. It would have given her dignity without requiring a public fight. If Catherine accepted the crown, Camilla would have to defend her position against the appearance of a younger, more popular royal woman taking her place. If Catherine refused it, Camilla could remain the Queen of Charles's reign without Catherine appearing to celebrate her removal. That would be an extraordinary reversal. The woman supposedly receiving the crown would be the one protecting the woman who was supposed to lose it. Suddenly, the story would no longer be about jealousy. It would be about restraint. And that is precisely what makes the alleged confrontation more interesting than a simple royal feud. Catherine's strength would come not from taking the crown, but from refusing to let the crown define her relationship with Camilla. The palace would still have to answer the original question, however. Why was the crown being moved in the first place? That question would follow Charles beyond the room. It would follow him into public appearances, royal ceremonies, and every future photograph of the family. Once the image exists in the public imagination, it becomes difficult to erase, and the timing would matter. The monarchy is always preparing for succession, but preparation becomes more visible when the heir's family begins to dominate public attention. William and Catherine are not simply another royal couple. They are the couple expected to carry the institution into its next stage. That reality does not diminish Camilla's service. It simply means that her role belongs to a particular chapter of the monarchy. Catherine's belongs to the chapter that comes afterward. The danger comes when those chapters appear to overlap. If Charles was truly trying to signal Catherine's importance, the crown would have been an extraordinarily blunt way to do it. If he was trying to protect the monarchy's future, he would need to avoid making the present look discarded. And if Catherine understood that, her refusal would have been less an act of rebellion than an attempt to restore the boundary between the two reigns. That is why the reported question about Camilla matters more than the reported crown itself. Catherine allegedly wanted an explanation, not applause, not celebration, not a photograph, an explanation. And once that question was asked, the entire balance of the scene changed. Charles could no longer simply hand over the symbol and move forward. Camilla could no longer remain a silent figure in the background. William could no longer watch as though the matter had nothing to do with his future. Everyone had been pulled into the same question. What happens when the future arrives before the present is ready to surrender its place? That is the question hanging over this entire story. And if Catherine's refusal was meant to protect Camilla, it may also have revealed something about Catherine herself. She understood that the easiest way to become the future queen was not to take someone else's crown. It was to make sure that when her own moment finally arrived, nobody could say she had needed to steal it. That would make the crown's journey far more complicated than the title suggests. It would not simply move from Camilla to Catherine. It would expose the distance between them. And that distance is where the next shock begins, because once the question of Camilla's crown was raised, the focus turned to what Charles knew, what Catherine had noticed, and what the palace might have been preparing for long before anyone saw the crown move. If this story has made you question whether the crown should ever be used to humiliate one royal woman for another, then prove you are paying attention by liking, sharing, and subscribing now, because the next part takes that unanswered question straight into the future of the monarchy. The crown was never the real prize. That is the conclusion waiting at the end of this story, because once the dust settles, the most important question is not whether Charles could place a crown before Catherine. It is whether Catherine understood what accepting it would have meant for Camilla, for William, and for the monarchy itself. The title promises a shocking transfer, but the deeper story is about succession, symbolism, and the danger of making the future look as though it has already replaced the present. Catherine's reported refusal changes the meaning of everything that came before it. If she truly rejected the crown because she would not accept an honor built on Camilla's humiliation, then the moment becomes less about ambition and more about judgment. She would have recognized something that royal ceremonies often conceal. Symbols can wound. A crown can announce authority. It can confirm status. It can tell millions of people who stands at the center of an institution. But it can also create the impression that one person has been displaced so another can rise. That is why Catherine's alleged response carries such weight. She did not need to prove that she was the future queen. The succession already points toward the reign of William, assuming he succeeds his father. Catherine's eventual position beside him does not depend on taking anything from Camilla today. Her future is built into the next stage of the monarchy. Camilla's position is different. Her role belongs to Charles's reign, and her public service has become part of the history of that reign. Whatever controversy surrounded her earlier years, she reached the throne and took on the responsibilities attached to it. Reducing that journey to a rivalry with Catherine would erase the complexity of what actually happened. That is why the crown becomes such a powerful symbol in this story. It forces the audience to look at two women standing at different points on the same royal road. One represents the present, the other represents what comes next. Neither position requires the other woman to fail, and yet public attention can make it appear that way. Catherine's popularity, visibility, and future role have made her central to conversations about the monarchy's survival. Her public work has helped shape a newer image of royal service. Her connection to William places her directly beside the future sovereign. Her presence therefore carries an importance that goes beyond individual ceremonies. But popularity cannot crown anyone. The British monarchy is governed by succession, not by online votes, newspaper headlines, or the number of people who prefer one royal over another. Public approval matters because the institution depends on public confidence, but it does not replace constitutional order. That distinction is essential. It means the future does not need to be manufactured through a dramatic handover. When William eventually becomes king, Catherine's role will change because the monarchy changes with him. That transition does not require Charles to strip Camilla of her dignity. It does not require Catherine to defeat her. It does not require a palace confrontation. Time itself provides the transition, and perhaps that is why the alleged crown incident is so revealing. It creates a question that ordinary succession would never need to ask. Why rush the future? If Catherine already has a secure path toward queenship, what purpose would be served by placing Camilla's symbolic position in jeopardy before the present reign has ended? The answer remains uncertain. It could be interpreted as a gesture toward the future. It could be read as a signal about Charles's priorities. It could simply be the kind of royal rumor that grows because the public already knows Catherine's eventual importance. But whatever interpretation someone chooses, the emotional question remains: should the future be celebrated by humiliating the present? That is where Catherine's alleged refusal becomes the strongest moment in the entire account. A woman waiting for her own crown could have accepted the advantage. Instead, she reportedly questioned the circumstances. That does not make her perfect. It does not prove that every rumor surrounding the palace is true. It does something more useful. It gives the audience a reason to reconsider the easy version of the story. The easy version says Camilla loses and Catherine wins. The harder version asks whether anyone actually wins when a family institution turns succession into personal humiliation. That question reaches beyond Charles, Camilla, and Catherine. It reaches the monarchy itself. A modern royal family cannot survive on ceremony alone. It needs credibility. It needs continuity. It needs people to believe that its representatives understand the weight of their positions. The crown is therefore not merely an object passed from one head to another. It is a promise that the institution will continue beyond the people currently occupying its most visible roles. Charles's legacy will eventually be judged by what happens after his reign. William will inherit a monarchy shaped by his father's choices. Catherine will enter that reign carrying the expectations created during these years. Their children will grow into a royal system that will be judged by an even younger generation of the public. That makes every decision about transition more important. If Charles supports Catherine, it does not automatically mean he is turning against Camilla. If Catherine becomes more prominent, it does not automatically mean Camilla has become irrelevant. If Camilla's public role changes in the next reign, it does not automatically mean she has been defeated. These are separate realities. The danger comes when headlines compress them into one dramatic contest. That is where audiences can be misled. And that is also why this story has such staying power. It offers a simple image, Charles taking Camilla's crown and giving it to Catherine. But behind that image sits a complicated question about how monarchies manage change. The most compelling part is still Catherine's reported decision. If she really placed the crown back before Charles, then she rejected the easiest possible narrative. She refused to become the woman who visibly benefited from another woman's loss. That would have protected more than Camilla. It would have protected Catherine's own future. Because when her time eventually comes, the last thing Catherine needs is for her queenship to be remembered as something she took from another woman. She needs it to be understood as what it actually would be, the next constitutional stage of the monarchy. That is the difference between taking a crown and inheriting one. One looks like conquest, the other looks like continuity. And perhaps that is the message hidden inside the most shocking part of this entire story. The woman who appears to be receiving the crown may actually have been the only person in the room willing to question why it was being offered. Camilla's journey cannot be erased. Catherine's future cannot be stopped. Charles's reign cannot last forever. Those three facts can exist together without turning the royal family into a battlefield. But if the palace ever forgets that distinction, the consequences will not remain inside the palace. The public will notice. The press will notice. And every crown, photograph, appointment, and ceremonial gesture will become evidence in a much larger argument about who the monarchy really belongs to. So the image to remember is not simply Charles holding a crown, it is Catherine refusing to let that crown become a weapon. That is what makes the alleged moment so striking. The future queen did not need to prove that she was ready for the future by taking something from the present. If anything, she proved her strength by questioning the cost of accepting it. Because once a queen becomes more visible than the queen of the present, every gesture carries a meaning. A smile can look, a seating position can look, a photograph can become a headline, and a crown can become a warning. That is why this story refuses to end with the crown. The real battle is over what comes after it, and that leaves one final question for everyone watching. If the crown had truly been placed in front of Catherine, should she have worn it? Or was refusing it the strongest statement she could have made? Because the answer says something about more than Catherine. It says something about what people expect from a royal family when power changes hands. If this story made you question the way the monarchy handles women, power, and succession, do not stay silent. Like this video, share it with someone who follows the royal family, and subscribe to this channel. Every like, every share, and every subscription tells the platform that audiences want these uncomfortable questions examined, instead of buried beneath polished ceremonies and official smiles. And if you think stories like this deserve to be followed all the way to the end, turn on notifications now, because the next royal story coming to this channel goes even deeper, and what emerges next could make this crown controversy look like only the beginning.